to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Herbert Vere, or Doc Evatt, is one of the most controversial figures in Australia's political history. He fought 3 elections as Labor leader in 54, 55 and 58, failing to defeat his fierce rival and nemesis, Robert Menzies. Joining me to discuss this great political rivalry of Menzies and Evatt is Deputy Director of the Sydney Institute and author of Menzies Versus Evatt, the great rivalry of Australian politics, Anne Henderson. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Anne.
Very glad to be here, Georgina.
It's great to have you here in Melbourne. What used to be sunny Melbourne until yesterday, so apologies for the weather.
I'm from Melbourne a long time ago.
That's true.
Totally understand.
Oh, very good, very good. So, Anne, this book, Menzies Versus Evatt, I mean, I can't believe it's 2023 and it's only just been written. Tell me what led you to write such a fascinating story, and a story that absolutely deserves to be told.
Well, when we're launching it, John Howard said it was the book that was, overdue for being to be written. And his opposite number, Michael Kirby, thought it would make a good movie, but good luck to whoever wants to. But I
wonder who's playing who.
Yeah, well, that will be a good question. That would be a very good question. Someone with eyebrows on one side.
Oh, yes.
But it really began because I got going on looking at the referendum of 1951, which is an unusual referendum because, one, it was really close, which most referendums go down, and they usually, or like the one for the Aborigines in the 1960s, it was so easily won. It's not easily close. And as I did it, a bigger story was obvious, and that is that these two guys, Menzies and Evatt, who were the two spokesmen for yes and no, Menzies for yes, Evatt for no, were complete parallels in their life and complete opposites. And so I went back and tried to trace the bouts, as I call them, the big fights, and just have a look at what this tells you about their personality and the history of Australia. And Paul Kelly sort of says in the preface that it's like a Shakespearean tragedy, or like a Shakespearean play, but in the sense that it's got these big characters and this big fall for one and the other overcomes great odds. But it's also a Greek tragedy for Evatt because he was a very brilliant lawyer in the sense that he had everything that you could possibly have as the Minister for External Affairs and the Attorney General in the Curtin and Chifley governments. But once he got the leadership, he didn't put a foot right, except for the 1951 referendum.
I've always thought of Evatt that he was a brilliant man academically, professionally in the law, on policy, and very aspirational and ideological. But he had terrible judgment.
Mm-hmm. You're right. And he was a narcissist. And even Michael Kirby, who's sung his Evatt's praises for decades, came to the launch with John Howard and said, I had to agree with what I was saying, but I haven't said it first. There were biographers who had said it about Evatt. It was all about Evatt.
Right.
Everything he did was about what he was doing for Evatt.
And in the art of politics, even if that is in the background, it does need to be about the bigger picture.
It has to be collegiate.
Yes.
Yeah, and we've always said in our house that Peter Costello looked like he had the markings of the future leader of the Liberal Party, but everybody in the party has just one vote. And if you don't show a collegiate leadership, you're not going to get the votes. And I'm not saying he's an Evatt. I'm just saying that that's an illustration in closer times to why maybe Peter didn't go any further.
Yeah. So Menzies and Evatt, there are so many parallels. As you say, they lived these parallel lives. They were both born in 1894.
That's right.
Scholarship boys, the younger sons grew up in Menzies' case, Victoria, in Evatt's case, New South Wales. They were Protestants. They attended public school system. Then won scholarships.
One went to Wesley.
Yeah. And then they both had an attraction to the law, studied law, became KCs, and then into politics. And in some respects, their personalities had some similarities, but then also differences. And I think a lot of the failings you're picking out about Evatt Menzies sort of overcame them,
Yeah.
whereas Evatt never quite did. But tell me about this incredible set of circumstances that delivered two quite extraordinary people from our history.
Well, look, Menzies' family wasn't poor, but it wasn't rich. Evatt's family wasn't poor. It was middle class. They owned a hotel, I think, in Maitland in the Hunter Valley. But his father died when he was 7. So the mother had older sons who'd gone to Sydney, and she relocated to Milson's Point, where she lived nowadays is one of the plush suburbs of the Lower North Shore. But at the time she was there, it wasn't a bad place to live. But public education made a big difference to Evatt. He went to Fort Street High School, which was a selective high school, and he's a clever boy. And
that has an incredible alumni.
it has an incredible alumni. Yes. And Menzies likewise, while he went through the state system, he then went as a scholarship boy to Wesley, and Bert Evans went as a scholarship boy to university. They were living in the era when education could make a huge difference to a person in a modest middle-class sort of level. There weren't so many women that were lucky enough to find that way through. Some did. May Couchman was an interesting figure from the Liberal Party background. But they also were very bright. These were boys that at a time when scholarship was probably something exciting, whereas nowadays you're trying to drag them inside and tell them to stop looking at their games on their computers or wanting to sort of take off to a pub or somewhere. But they were in an era when to be a bright boy and to get prizes and to find your way up through education was a really exciting prospect for those that could do it. And they each did it in their own way. But the fascinating thing is that one was New South Wales and one was Victoria. And, you know, that sort of contrast between the two big states is there too.
Yes.
And Maitland was full of floods. And where was Menzies?
Jeparit.
Jeparit was the dry, dusty Wimmera affected by drought. There were all these sort of pictorial and metaphorical and real contrasts for these two fellows.
So they actually first came to meet each other, didn't they, through the law, not politics?
Well, interestingly, the engineers case,
yes,
Evatt actually acted on the other side as a junior, and Menzies, of course, made his reputation out of it because he challenged the judge. It was a grumpy, what's his name, Stark, I think. He was a grumpy, full of himself kind of judge. And as Menzies said later in his own writings, he never would have done it later. It was only that he was young and terribly eager to have his say that he told the judge virtually that what they were arguing was all rubbish and they ought to go back and look at the Constitution or look at the whole setup, which, of course, the judge must have dropped because he said, well, yes, Stark said, yeah, maybe we should. We'll meet again in Sydney or something like that. And, of course, that's what made Menzies' reputation, that he'd stood in front of this judge and had actually challenged the judge about the whole raison d'etre of the case they were arguing. Then Menzies' side won.
Is there any evidence that animosity developed in the engineers case between Evatt and Menzies?
No,
it was par for the course, I guess. No.
Evatt was in the Labor Party in Sydney during the 1920s. He fell out with Lang, like most people did. And then he went off to the High Court in 1930, as an appointee of a Labor government.
He must have been one of the youngest High Court judges.
Yes, very young. But it was obviously a political appointment, but he was certainly qualified for it. Most of his cases when he was a barrister were done for unions, and he did very well that way because he pretty much always found for the union. He was very obviously a Labor lawyer. But when he got to 1940 and he threw his hat in the ring for politics, he developed a popular image of someone who was bright and clever, and Labor thought he was marvellous because he had all this distinguished academic sort of background. And, of course, for Labor, that was quite outstanding.
Yes, of course, because Labor back then,
mostly working people.
Yeah, and political arm of the trade union movement. So a lot, Curtin and Chifley.
Yeah, well, themselves. Curtin he wrote a bit, but Chifley was a train driver and Curtin sort of worked his way out.
Yeah, so the impression you had of Labor MPs was that they were from the union.
They were very much the working class
people. So to have someone very, very educated and professionally accomplished.
And he'd made a lot of money by the time he went into politics. And he was toasted by the Women's Weekly. I mean, a beautiful photograph of his wife and children describing his beautiful house and all that stuff. There he was. So he went into politics, but at the time, the UAP had been in power from the beginning of 32 till...
And this is the United Australia Party,
sorry,
the precursor to the Liberal Party.
That's right.
Yes.
And Joe Lyons had died at the beginning of 39, April. Menzies had come into the leadership, and there was a big rift between him and the leader of the Country Party, Earl Page. So Menzies also had the reputation for being a bit stuck up. Lyons was very much the man of the people. He'd come from Labor. He had a charming way of talking like an ordinary Australian, whereas Menzies seemed to be while he was as educated as Bert Evatt, he threw off an aura because he wasn't one to sort of talk about himself and throw information about himself out like we do today, letting people into your private world. Menzies was very much one who drew a barrier between his private world, and his professional world. So he had the impression of being a bit distant, a bit up himself. And to some extent, he was a little bit superior. There are some lovely anecdotes about how he put people down.
Yes.
Something which he had to overcome. So Bert Evatt, I think, and Curtin had been in and out of politics. He'd lost his seat at one point and he'd come in as leader. There was no guarantee about Curtin that he would be the Prime Minister that he became. Bert Evatt obviously thought there was a possibility, an opening to lead Labor. I mean, he was popular. He won the seat in a landslide in the 1940 election. He had the media charmed, a little bit like today, Kevin Rudd coming out of the woodwork.
I mean, he'd been in the New South Wales Parliament, and then he'd been on the High Court, and then, as you say, in 1940 he quits the bench to run as a Labor candidate. So he hadn't come out of nowhere, as you say.
No.
But can you tell me, was it considered controversial at all that he was sort of flipping between the judiciary and Parliament?
No.
There were others. I did some research. There have been 13 members of Parliament who've gone to the High Court, so Barton, O'Connor, Isaacs, Higgins, McTin, and obviously Evatt, Latham, Barwick and Murphy. Can't imagine it happening these days for some reason. But back then, maybe our population was smaller. The types of people who were getting into politics and being appointed to the bench were from a similar, very small pool. But it does seem extraordinary.
It is extraordinary, but again, he was so young when he went to the High Court. And he was very ambitious. And at the time, there were bigger things around. Would the United Australia Party collapse? Because it had been a party driven by a moment of time. It never really had not a manifesto, but a sort of a
philosophical foundation.
The documentation of what it stood for and all the rest of it. It was very much a practical outcome of the Depression. So there was all of that. There was the problem of Menzies. Labor was focused on possibly winning the 1940 election, especially after the air crash killed 3 of the most significant ministers just a month before the election. So he sort of, Evatt always managed to do that, to sort of be toasted in. Labor loved him. He was their big... The book I talk about when he's had his day and he's made a fool of himself and he's messed up 54 and Petro and everything else, and they sort of kept him on till 58. They carried him along like a mascot. It's like the teddy bear.
It's interesting.
He was their big boy.
So Menzies obviously resigns in 41 and then eventually Curtin takes over after, I think it's...
The Fadden government fell.
The 40 days of Fadden.
The 2 independents left the
Very
UAP.
biblical. I think Fadden even spoke about the biblical nature of his term as Prime Minister. But, I mean, Evatt's External Affairs Minister and Attorney General, 2 pretty major portfolios. I mean, I appreciate Gough Whitlam was, I think he had 9 portfolios when he became Prime Minister. So, others have done it before. But Evatt was in these 2 significant positions when the Curtin government is trying to put forward a significant constitutional agenda, but also setting up the United Nations too.
That's true.
And Evatt, of course, becomes the first president of the General Assembly, but he's very significant. I mean,
yes, he had a very significant offshore life.
I think they call him the midwife of the United Nations.
Well, something like that. Well, that all suited him absolutely. It was on his grave, his widow put that he was the first president of the United Nations, but left out the Assembly, because he wasn't the president of the United Nations. He was the president of the United States Assembly, which was a fairly small and fledgling group, nonetheless very significant. But his view of politics was always that everything could be settled with discussion, with dialogue, with coming together, and he pushed for the smaller nations to have a voice and all that sort of thing. Menzies, on the other hand, was so different. He wasn't against the United Nations, but he had little time for it because he didn't see it as solving the problems. His view was much closer to the Americans and the British, that you might see a role for a United Nations. The League of Nations had failed, certainly didn't stop the Second World War. The United Nations also hasn't stopped wars for decades. But they believed in defence pacts, defence alliances, the sort of thing that had got the Allies through the Second World War. So during Menzies' time, there's ANZUS, there's CETO. And John Howard grumbled that I hadn't mentioned that I put in the Japanese Trade Agreement of 1957. And my argument to that is, well, that wasn't about, a fight between Menzies and Evatt. It was just something that was legislation, and I think McEwen had more to do with it. But anyway, that's John Howard's thing, that we were, and he's right. We were very far advanced to have done that trade deal with Japan in 1957 under Menzies. So I sort of see Menzies as the significant originator of Australia's big treaty agreements for the Pacific, in spite of the fact that he was very pro-British, and he didn't particularly, he held his nose with ANZUS because it left the British out. But it was, Curtin is seen as the person who turned Australia's face to America. But we'd been turning our face to America quietly without any big announcements till the war. But after that, it was the Menzies government that put in place those big defence agreements.
So after the Second World War, obviously there's the development of the United Nations, and as you say, Evatt is instrumental in that and first president of the General Assembly. But his view is one of internationalism. He's a liberal internationalist, and there are fantastic achievements, the creation of the State of Israel. That
he was very involved with that, yes.
Very, very instrumental in delivering. But Menzies is more of a realist. Although I think they did agree on quite a bit, didn't they, when it came to the United Nations? They both thought that the veto power of the permanent members of the Security Council was a bad idea and would end up being
they weren't totally
obstructionist
against that, any of that sort of the structural analysis of what the United Nations was going to do. Where Menzies and Evatt diverged in their paths was that Menzies never thought the United Nations could solve the problems of world peace.
No.
He believed that there had to be a stronger stand against places like the Soviet Union. And he saw the Soviet Union as replacing Nazi Germany. In other words, as the next big baddie that we had to work towards. Now, Evatt, of course, he led a very sloppy office administration. He was very indifferent to secret documents lying around. He didn't see them as important. He didn't see things like the Secret Service as important. He treated the Russians as if they were an ally because they'd been an ally in the Second World War, but he hadn't kind of taken in what was happening in Europe. I'm trying to think who said it. Beazley, the older Beazley, said that Evatt thought the Soviet Union was out to win the war, when in fact it was out to win the world. And Evatt didn't see that. He didn't see how without battles you could actually move your areas of influence in a sort of soft power or even a strong direct power way, which is what the Soviet did after the Second World War.
And under Evatt's watch too, there were very significant issues with the External Affairs Department, weren't there? And its relationship with
by the time of the end of the Chifley government, the US and the Brits wouldn't trust Australia with the Venona intercepts. They didn't even tell them they were going on, the Manhattan Project, all that stuff. And that's why Chifley set up ASIO, because they did eventually tell him that we're not being treated as on the same level of trust. We had the same level of trust as Pakistan. We were in with Pakistan. But that was all because of Evatt and because of the head of the department, I think his name, I don't know well a minute, and a number of people that worked for him, which again came back to haunt him in the Petrov inquiry because they were named as being too close to the Soviet embassy.
So while Evatt is obviously busy with the United Nations agenda, which was a significant one, and we have to remember this is the pre-jet airline age, so air travel is long.
And he hated air travel.
Right, yes.
There are some lovely things.
Bit of a problem when you're the External Affairs
Well, there are some
Minister.
lovely things that have come out because people remembered working with him. Peter Crockett got a hold of the best of them, like taking a fishing rod on a plane in case they crashed on an island in the Pacific. I don't think there'd be much left of the fishing rod when you got down. He stacked himself on a number of occasions with newspapers under his shirt so that he went through the meeting crinkling. The newspapers crinkled as he moved. But that was because of the fear of getting freezing in the air and all this sort of stuff. But for all that fear of flying, he was never off a plane.
No.
He flew around Australia. He flew around the world. He was everywhere.
But this must have been a problem for his role as Attorney General. And, I mean, there was a significant agenda of Chifley's, the nationalisation of the banks.
That's why probably he did so badly.
So how was he managing that agenda while at the same time being an external affairs
Well, not
minister?
well. He missed a lot of the debates, left it to Chifley, but he was the one who appeared for, because there you go, you'd be a politician, and he put himself in front of the High Court. Now, he was very capable of landing, say, in San Francisco, a great pile of papers on the United Nations had to be absorbed. He could almost speed read and absorb that. This is brilliance, academic, very brilliant. So he's very good at mastering a case, mastering information. But when it came to the banking legislation, and he went on for days and days and days with his arguments, which were not new. They just kept repeating. Some of the judges had been on the High Court when he was there, and they weren't very friendly to him. So he was he didn't have a good argument, but he also was irritating the people who were making the judgments. So anyway, the banking legislation was lost and it went to this Privy Council in London. So it went on for 2.5 years or something. So from August 47, 48, 49, so 2 years. By the time it was knocked back by the Privy Council, two of the judges of the Privy Council died.
Of boredom?
While it was probably. But it makes a lovely story.
It does, yeah.
And I haven't got figures in front of me, but the number of days he spoke was almost half the time that the whole thing sat. But it was almost ready to go to an election. And, of course, the banks threw the money in. But he'd convinced Chifley that he could do it. He could win. And he didn't. And that, to some extent, was because he wasn't really focused on the case.
So Menzies gets in 1949, in December, and an auspicious year we've just been discussing. Other things happened that year. And then one of Menzies' great missions was to ban the Communist Party. He'd said he would do that. Great concerns about the spread of global communism, the Korean War in 1950.
Fall of China.
Yeah, fall of China. Yeah, this,
1949.
In 1949, exactly.
So the communists.
So there were great concerns around the spread of communism and then what might happen if it reached Australia's doorstep.
And what might happen if we had a functioning Communist Party here, etc.
That's right. So the story, of course, is incredibly relevant for today because it's about a very important
this is where I began,
big picture referendum.
Well, it went in and out of Parliament.
So we know Menzies is championing this ban on communism in Australia, which inevitably goes to a referendum. But what was Evatt's view on this?
Well, Herbert, he ended up, when everything went bad with Petrov, was almost in tears telling Parliament he wasn't a communist, which he never was. No, he wasn't. But he had this tendency to, as we've just been discussing, to see Soviet communism as no danger. We could deal with them. And he had, after the legislation went through,
This is
the
Menzies'
Parliament
ban,
with banning the Communist Party.
legislative ban.
Yeah,
yes.
the first time. He took the case for the communist unions in the High Court and won. So he was associated with supporting the Communist Party.
And what was Chifley's position on this? Because
Chifley kept out of it. Chifley's attitude to the doc was one where he was very happy for him to be the Minister of External Affairs because he waved him goodbye every time he caught an airplane somewhere else. Right. I think Chifley saw that he was a wise old fellow, Chifley, in the sense that he's not all that old these days. He handled his party well, as did Curtin, and he knew where Evatt's weaknesses were and where they would be bad for the party. And he also knew that he was ambitious and he'd knock him off tomorrow if he could, take his place. So Chifley, he had to walk a very tight rope. And there was this problem also of the caucus because a number of the Labor people were anti-communist, strongly anti-communist, which is leading up to the Labor split. So they got an instruction to pass the bill from the non-parliamentary party, in other words, the state executive, whatever. Yeah, so they were pushing their weight around as well because there were anti-communists and whatever there. So the bill went through and then it went to the High Court with Evatt and it was knocked back. So Menzies called an election 51, double dissolution, which he was quite happy to do because he hadn't won the Senate. And the Senate had changed the rules of election in 49. It had a weird system, and I can't remember technically what it was, but if you won a state, I think you got everyone or something like that. So Labor had a really stacked Senate. In 49, the Liberal Party won, and National Party, a country party, won back enough seats. But because it's a half Senate election, they still didn't have a majority in the Senate. So at the double dissolution, the Liberal Country Party won a majority in the Senate. So while the legislation for banning the Communist Party had failed and whatever, Menzies had achieved in, less than 2 years, control of both houses. Okay, so then the legislation goes through and there's a referendum. And that's how that came about in September 1951. In the middle of all that, in June, I think, Chifley died after the election campaign because it had really put an enormous strain on him.
So Evatt becomes leader, of course, which he had wanted since 1940, really, and he decides to become a no.
He becomes the big no person,
and
that was. It's very interesting, this referendum. Now, we have a referendum today where the leader of the opposition is Peter Dutton, and he hasn't come out as the leading figure. He's got Jacinta Price, and then there's Warren Mundine, and there's a couple of others. But he's obviously against the Voice. So he's kind of introduced himself to the Australian people through this referendum, nothing like Bert Evatt did. Bert Evatt, he got going 2 or 3 weeks before Menzies, crisscrossed the country like nothing. They were writing up how many miles he'd travelled.
With his newspaper, lining his shirt.
Whatever it was.
And the fishing rod.
He started up in northern Queensland under a tree in Townsville, I think it was, or Cairns, one of them. And he just used it to introduce himself as leader of the Labor Party to the Labor faithful.
Yeah.
And then when he won his side by very narrow margin, he had kind of established his credentials. It was very clever.
And equally, Menzies is the face of the Yes campaign through this, but I mean, obviously very, very familiar to the Australian public and absolutely to the liberal voting public. But it's extraordinary looking at the history of this 51 referendum on banning the Communist Party, that it starts out where Yes is hugely popular. 80%, I think, in one point. You have in your book 73%.
Yep. It goes down in weeks.
In early August. So polling day is the 22nd of September, and it's line ball, isn't it, the result?
Absolutely. No one can predict. And it was almost, the result was a matter of 50,000 votes or something. It was really line ball. And referendums don't usually end up that way. Mostly they end up very much no gets a huge margin. The one on Aboriginal matters in the 1960s was 67.
67, yes.
That was a huge yes. But again, both sides were supporting it, both the government and the opposition. So this was, it's quite an unusual referendum. But out of it, Evatt did very well. On the other hand, it wasn't all about the referendum and it wasn't all about communism, because one of the myths of Labor history over the decades has been that the 54 election, which was the next election, was won because of the Petrov defection. But in fact, if you go through the newspapers that I've done, what happened was the 53 budget. Artie Fadden as Treasurer was determined to hit inflation. They had, very like today, it was worse actually. It was post-war inflation, and there was a Korean War, which also pushed inflation. And so they had a horror budget in 52, and it worked. And by 53, inflation was under control and they handed out the goodies. and one cartoonist had Menzies being shouldered off the field of a Victorian football league. Remember, this were the days of Victorian football league.
Yes.
He's being carried off the field, amazing champion, winner of the grand final, whatever he was, the captain of all, as the 53 budget, that it had captured people. So when they went into 54, while Labor expected to win, and most people putting their money on the bets, if they had them in those days, thought Labor had a very good chance of winning, their margin whittled down as people realised times were getting better, but also the Queen visited. And she was here for 2 months or something, or three.
That's right.
A huge visit.
57 days.
She was here a long time.
Yes.
She went everywhere. And Evatt went round with her too, and the premiers were all Labor, and except for, I think, for South Australia. But the fact was people felt good. And it would have been good for the economy, as you can imagine. We talk about pop artists coming. Taylor Swift, she's going to boost the economy when she does her concerts in Australia. Well, the Queen was ahead of Taylor Swift because she brought, everyone was feeling good. They were printing memorabilia and food.
Look, this was a time of popular monarchism, so Labor wasn't instinctively Republican.
No,
Evatt was monarchist.
He was turning up to shake, not to shake the Queen's hand, but to
bow,
yeah. And all of that. But it had a big impact on the feeling of the country. Not enough to bring about a landslide for Menzies in 54, but if you read the newspapers through the election campaign, although Petrov defected in April, and the election campaign was a month or so, 2 months or something afterwards, the actual discussion of the Petrov inquiry doesn't come up. They opened the Petrov inquiry, but it didn't bring up any issues. The names of Evatt's staffers weren't mentioned. And Menzies said years later, if he'd wanted to use the Petrov defection, he could have, because he knew the names of the people who were mentioned on Evatt's staff, but they were never revealed until after the election. Evatt had supported the Petrov inquiry. He'd gone out of his way to say that they needed to investigate the papers.
It's interesting. So Evatt has obviously a hugely strong reputation on human rights and the law and social equality. But when it comes to the economy, he doesn't have a credible
and that was another
reputation,
reason
does it?
During the election campaign. Labor went overboard with spending. And they went overboard with spending to the extent where they said they would spend money. What a funny thing about that today. They would spend money they didn't collect in taxes that they maybe raised on borrowing, which is ahead of its time, actually. But it was so far ahead of its time, it didn't go down very well because most people said, well, where are we going to borrow this money from or whatever, where are you going to get the money from to fund this list of things you're going to do. It was one step too far. There was another election in the 80s, I think, with Hawke. No, one of them, can't remember. But I think the Liberals might have said they were going to spend more than they could, and there was a whingy Wendy, where's the money coming from? I can't remember the details of it, but it doesn't pay to go too far spending exorbitantly because people aren't stupid. They know that if you can't pay for what you're offering, you either won't get it or you'll get the bill later.
Well, that's right. That's right. We're learning that pretty quickly.
Yes, in Victoria, I think you might be learning that.
So it's interesting of Evatt, it's often said that with the communism referendum, he won the battle, but he lost the war, the bigger war against Menzies. So he loses 54.
Yeah, that's a big one. That really hurt him.
Yeah.
And he was a conspiratorial person. People say, his illness because he ended up being a very strangely, it might have been dementia. I don't know what his condition was, but as he got older, before he died, he wasn't very strong mentally. His conspiracy theories, his feeling that Menzies had tricked him, had used means to link him with Petrov. Then when the Petrov Commission began, after he'd lost the election, he chose to stand and represent his own staffers. Now, his brother Clive would have been a far better choice. He would have been a real lawyer, whereas Evatt saw every day in the court, it was him. He wasn't defending them. He was defending himself in the sense that he had to get them off in order to show that he wasn't linked with the communists. And, of course, it didn't play well with the judges, and he eventually was asked to stop and leave and not represent them any longer.
So in this time, of course, there are big issues for the Labor Party as a political organisation, as a united political party, particularly here in Victoria, of course. Yes. And you have one of the famous Labor splits. There were a few of them, but this was the really, really big one, which resulted, of course, in the formation of the Democratic Labor Party with its non-parliamentarian leader, of course, B.A. Santamaria.
Yeah. So, B.A. Santamaria wasn't big like he became, but he was very influential with the Catholic groupers, as they called them. There were non-Catholic unions who were anti-communist. But Evatt tried to Duchess Santamaria before the election. He had 2 meetings with him. And Santamaria wasn't fooled. Santamaria went home and told his wife he'd met with someone who didn't have a soul or something like that. So in other words, Santamaria saw right through him and knew that whatever he offered, and Santamaria he would, after the election, he'd just wipe him. Well, after the election, he was furious, and that's why he turned on the groupers. And there's some amazing recollections of people who were at the caucus meetings where he stood on a table and screamed at them and whatever. But when you actually read what the Labor Party did to itself, it's just staggering. In Victoria, they expelled tens and tens of significant leaders, and it was just extraordinary. They killed their own party.
Do you think that a different Labor leader might have handled it in such a way that there wouldn't have been a Labor split?
Well, there isn't a lot of choice if you look at it, but I've posited the view that, see, Arthur Calwell in the caucus had the very bad, screaming, mad, crazy caucus meeting that was had. He actually stood with the groupers, but he never put his hand up for election as leader. No one had the temerity to stand against Evatt. They thought they just wouldn't win it. But had Calwell managed to show that temerity and grabbed enough votes to take on, he would never have done what Evatt did. I mean, what Evatt did after the election, they should have changed the leader. It wouldn't happen today. If you lost 51, then you lost 54 when you thought you were going to win it. I mean, if that would have happened today, John Hewson would still be leading the Liberal Party. So what happened was that it was his personality, it was his absolute anger at what he believed had been done to him. And he believed not only had Menzies tricked him, that his own groupers hadn't supported him enough. I don't even know why he felt so angry about them in particular. There was one of them who'd made a statement in the election campaign disagreeing with one bit of Labor policy, but it wasn't enough to have stopped him winning the election. But he really decided that was the reason, that combined forces had stood in his way.
Do you think there was much of a sectarian element involved in Evatt's dealings with
He wasn't a sectarian. I don't think he was a sectarian, but you can find threads of it. I don't think he fully understood, or he misunderstood just how weak or strong they were. I mean, when the split did come, they all lost their seats. They didn't form a party that was in any way a challenge to the government. It only just ruined them because they kicked out some very good people. And then, of course, another little trick, they gave their preference to the Liberals.
Well, there is some analysis.
The DLP, that is.
Yes,
yeah.
there is some analysis that Menzies kept winning elections because of DLP.
He was the ultimate winner of the 54 mess. Yeah. And I have actually got to a point where I say, if you look at it closely, I think one of the other reasons that Evatt went off his face, or one of the major, was because of his feelings about Menzies. Menzies was the one he didn't want to lose to. Menzies was the one he wanted to beat, and Menzies was the one he lost to. And I see Menzies as one of the factors in the Labor split as a result, because Benati Fadden leading the Liberal Party, it wouldn't have been the same. It was that feeling that he'd been done by the man he had to beat.
And Menzies really, he does do a real job on Evatt in Parliament. And, I mean, it's worth reflecting on that. There's obviously the Royal Commission into the Petrov affair. And
you can just see Menzies look, he let him come in after the whole inquiry, and it was pretty much obvious, and he'd lost, and he let him ramble on for heaven knows how long, 2 hours, whatever. And all he did was repeat his arguments in the commission. And then Menzies sort of begins by saying, well, I'm not here to rerun the inquiry. In other words, he doesn't even have to try. And he was so much more, Evatt didn't have Menzies' theatrical presentation. Menzies could have almost done a job on the stage. Heather, his daughter, once said that he had to do a 7-minute something speech, whatever, and without a clock and without a note, he spoke for the exact time. He was quite a master of presentation. And in the Parliament, it's so obvious if you read the two speeches and whatever, they're back and forth. But Menzies he's watched his victim. He's lost respect.
Yes.
For Evatt, totally. And there's another factor in this. Menzies said to one of the major Canberra scribblers, as I call them, journalists, whose name was Chamberlain, and he said to him before the election that he didn't trust Evatt at all. He thought he was a danger to Australia. So what he was saying was he'd seen some of the Petrov stuff, and he realised that what the Americans and the Brits had been saying way back in the late 40s, he really believed that Evatt was a danger. Now, We might say that was a bit extreme, but that's what Menzies believes. So that's where the line comes, by hook or by crook. And he said, I'd leave Parliament this year, that's 54, but I have to stay to beat Bert Evatt.
To keep Evatt
because
out.
Because he's in danger. If he becomes Prime Minister, he will let Australia down.
So the final nail in the coffin for Evatt's, I guess, prime ministerial ambitions is this letter he writes to
Molotov.
To the the foreign minister of the USSR, Molotov.
Menzies didn't even have to try.
I mean, this is incredible. So
this was a year after the inquiry when they were actually handing it down in Parliament.
So the opposition leader says in Parliament, well, I wrote to the foreign minister of the USSR asking if
the documents that Petrov gave were genuine, yes.
If these documents were genuine. And Molotov said no. Yeah. And so therefore we should all believe.
Well, apparently both sides, Labor and Liberal, Country Party, they were just all laughing their heads off.
So they did. They laughed.
In the Parliament.
In the Parliament.
They just couldn't stop themselves. It was just the most ridiculous thing. John Howard talks about hearing on the radio, and he and his father were listening, and he said it was just hysterical. So, well, it was hysterically bad. It was
terrible judgment.
Jaws were dropping. How could you be so naive?
Naive, that's right. So tell me what happens after that. Is that
it's
really
pretty bad, but he's still there. There was an election after the Labor split. There was an election 55, I think.
Yes,
and they just carried him, as I said, like a mascot. They just couldn't find the sort of balls, if you want to use that language, to say, time to go, Doc. And, of course, he would have been a difficult person to shift. And how they got rid of him, or they moved him from the Parliament, was they stitched up a deal with the New South Wales government and got him on the New South Wales Supreme Court.
And that convinced him to go?
Yeah, well, he took it and went. They changed his seat. I think he ended up with a seat in Hunter Valley somewhere, because Nancy Wake nearly beat him in 51. I'm trying to remember which election it was. It was 50. No, she stood against him in 49. She stood against him in 51. I think that's right. You can check that out. But she came within something like 250 votes or 300 votes of him. So for a man who'd won that seat with 10,000 or something majority or whatever it was when he won the first time, he kept it strongly right through his years in government. It was obviously having an impact, this notion of where did he stand on this rather important issue.
It's interesting, Menzies defeats 4 Labor leaders throughout his political career, and the correspondence you see here in the collection, but also through letters that are held by the National Library and archives, is often quite congenial. He seemed to have a very close relationship with John Curtin.
Oh, yeah.
He was very
Chifley.
Very positive with Chifley. But Evatt...
Yeah, it goes back.
It was, as Paul Kelly said, elemental cruelty. They really, really despised each other. And it's quite different, I think, from the other relationship.
It's a clash of personality. Lord Carrington, who was High Commissioner in Australia many years ago, he said the only thing they had in common was a love of cricket. Not quite. But in policy and personality, they're so different. Peter Crockett, the biographer of Evatt, he had access to a lot of papers and interviews with people who'd worked with Evatt. And I use it just to begin the first chapter. He goes back and finds some correspondence between Evatt and Menzies just around about the time of the 1940 election or thereabouts. And it shows there that Menzies didn't treat him with the respect or quite of a former justice of the High Court. And it could be that Menzies sort of picked him as not being a true blue player, that he was really in it for himself, and he didn't like that. See, that Menzies was of an old school, and I understand who they are, and Hasluck is very good at describing how he found Menzies in his books. He thought his own private world was for him. He didn't want to discuss. It didn't really matter. It wasn't that there was anything to hide. And we talk about it now with 24/7 media and social media. How do people protect themselves when they're in the public eye from scrutiny about things that is not important, and that's their personal right to keep them private?
Yes.
But even back then, Menzies had this thing where, and it may have come from people in another era, where a certain sort of wall was built. You didn't get behind that wall. He wasn't going to tell you what he had for breakfast. But when you got behind the wall, if you had to meet him, people have told me, like Heather and others, he's lovely with the children who lived next door and all these sorts of things. He could be very personable, very lovely. So was Evatt. But Evatt could change also and be very nasty. Whereas Menzies didn't have those swings of personality. Evatt did. Evatt could be really cruel And then he could be his wife used to go around mopping up the mess, giving toys to people's children because they'd been totally insulted unjustly. So there was all this. And right from the beginning, it was like Evatt just didn't appeal to him.
No.
And Menzies not being not crawling or duchessing or trying to treat him with the right respect, that also Evatt was out to prove he was better.
Well, a rivalry that unfortunately for Evatt didn't go his way, but fortunately for Menzies it did. Anne Henderson, this is a fantastic new book published by Connor Court, I think available on their website and other good places. Menzies Versus Evatt, the great rivalry of Australian politics. Thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.